Welcome to part 9 of the new imperialism. Now we're going to talk about Europe catching Britain. Now, as we've seen, Britain has led the way both in industrialization and in imperialistic expansion. But by the latter half of the 1800s, we're going to see that Britain's going to start slowing down and the rest of the world is going to start catching up, right? For example, the British gross national product, the GNP, from 1820 to 1850 is going to grow at about 3.5% per year, right? But during the period of 1870 to 1914, the beginning of World War I, it's going to slow down to about 2.2%, right? So it's slowing down. Britain in 1870 produced half of the world's steel. But by 1880, just 10 years later, it only produced 1/3. And by 1902, it was only producing 1/7. In 1870, Britain controlled 41% of the global trade, but by 1914 that was down to 30%. So Britain's slowing down, but at the same time, Germany and the United States are growing by leaps and bounds. The GNP of both those nations are increasing by 5%, over twice as much between 1870 and 1914. Germany is going to surpass Britain in steel production in 1893, and by 1914 is going to be making twice as much. So by 1914, Germany and the United States are handling nearly as much trade as Great Britain is. Now, of course, the United States is going to continue to skyrocket, as we mentioned before. Ultimately, they are going to produce more than all of Europe combined. But for Britain, this shift of economic position versus the rest of the world is pretty disturbing, especially when we start to take a look at Germany. Germany is going to become not just a competitor, but a potential threat. So with the British slowing down and Germany on the rise, anything that Germany does is going to be eyed with suspicion by the British. This is one of the reasons why that Otto von Bismarck was particularly adamant about not trying to build up a German navy. As the way he saw it anyways, there was no real reason to. Germany was a land power, with its traditional rivals being France to the west and Russia to the east, and they should focus on building armies in the classic Prussian style, and they'd always built good armies. Meanwhile, the British, who had created this global empire and being an island nation, was a naval power, and they had built a grand fleet, a fleet that was twice as large as its nearest rival. Okay, so there was no reason to create a competition or arms race between the two, right? This is going to change, though, when in 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm II is going to take the throne. In the 1890s, he's going to fire Bismarck, right? He's going to get rid of him, and he's going to begin building up the Navy. Now, just as Bismarck had predicted, this is going to cause a lot of alarm with the British because they're going to think, what is a Central European land power doing building up a navy? What do they need warships for? And it's going to leave the British to create a foreign intelligence service called MI6, right? And it's also going to cause them to engage in a naval buildup. In 1906, the British are going to produce a new, faster, heavier gun battleship called the HMS Dreadnought. The Germans will respond in kind, though, and a naval arms race will develop. Each side building their next dreadnought, their next dreadnought-style battleship, and these dreadnoughts were essentially the ICBMs of that day, right? National wealth and prestige was measured by the number of dreadnoughts the nation had. So by the beginning of World War I in 1914, the British had 21 dreadnought-style battleships to form up its grand fleet, and the Germans had built 14, forming the backbone of their high seas fleet, right? And both navies had been training incessantly for what the Germans referred to as Der Tag, or the day, the next Trafalgar, if you will, right? Where the two navies would clash and naval supremacy would be decided once and for all, right? In fact, by 1914, though, the great powers on all sides have been stockpiling not just battleships, but all kinds of weapons, ammunition, artillery, rifles, machine guns, and building vast armies, right? As the 20th century dawned, it almost seemed inevitable that the long-standing general peace in Europe was eventually going to explode into full-out war. All they finally needed was some sort of trigger. Now, in order to try and prevent an explosion in the war and preserve the peace, Otto von Bismarck had actually developed an alliance system to help keep that from happening. However, once he was gone and Wilhelm II was in charge of the nation, in the German nation, that same alliance system would instead prove part of the spark that would light the fuse and set all of Europe into war.